to step back in time to London 1940, despite the fact you'd still be able to pick out the great familiar landmarks such as Buckingham Palace, St Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, wonderful green parks and open spaces. You'd also find a city, and for that matter, an entire nation under siege. This was the year that brought home to the people of Great Britain the real impact of a world at war, on this occasion for the second time in the 20th century. Even before war broke out, albeit only by 2 days, a blackout was imposed, which meant that as darkness fell, all the lights were quite literally blacked out. Street lamps were switched off and all houses fitted with blackout curtains, and there were wardens to make sure not a chink of light appeared. The idea was to make life as difficult as possible for the German bombers to find a target in the dark. However, for the people of Britain, there were problems. Traffic accidents increased as headlights were also blacked out. In fact, in the early stages of the war, more people were killed in accidents as a result of the blackout than were lost in enemy action. Country folk who had never had the luxury of street lighting fared much better than their town-dwelling counterparts. Towards the end of 1940, the blackout had little effect when it came to protecting the people of Britain and Londoners in particular. The Blitz was the term used for Adolf Hitler's bombing campaign, designed to break the morale of the British people and force them into submission. The attack was sustained night after night as people had to learn to live with the constant threat of death. As night fell, air raid sirens would sound as soon as the enemy aircraft were spotted, allowing people to take shelter. Many children had been evacuated from Britain's big cities to the safety of the countryside, but there were still some families who chose not to be split up. In London, thousands of folk sheltered in underground railway stations where a spirit of camaraderie developed that even the constant bombing couldn't break. Each night, the skyline of London was illuminated by explosions and fires, and each morning people would emerge to survey the damage. There was no distinction between rich and poor for the bombers. Buckingham Palace was damaged just like the thousands of East End slum houses that were hit. Some found their homes and possessions were nothing but a pile of rubble. Others lost loved ones, and many were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the gas masks which they carried at all times. The government had issued gas masks at the beginning of the war, expecting huge casualties as the result of poison gas. Children were issued with Mickey Mouse nicknamed gas masks in the hope that they wouldn't be afraid of the definitely alarming contraptions. Although when you think of the Blitz, London immediately springs to mind, many other cities were also badly damaged. In the campaign, Plymouth, Birmingham, Liverpool and Coventry all suffered, with Coventry in particular facing a devastating onslaught. On a cold and frosty night, the Germans targeted Coventry with the clear light of the moon to guide their way. It was an act of war that is still talked about by present-day inhabitants of Coventry. However, the numbers are ever decreasing of those who actually recount the story of that night from personal experience. And as time goes on, all that will be left is their recorded testimonies, a precious archive indeed for future generations. If the nights were terrifying, the days were also fraught with worry. All fit young men were called up to join the Army, Navy or Air Force. As the war continued, This included those men aged between 18 and 41, which left few on the home front, as British forces were sent to Europe, the Far East and Africa. Scientists and engineers were excluded from the draft, as their jobs were of vital importance to the war effort, and those not deemed fit enough for the forces often joined the Home Guard. Nicknamed Dad's Army, because of the advanced years of many of their members, they trained in preparation for an enemy invasion, something that they all took very seriously, despite being the good-humoured butt of many a wartime joke. With the men of Britain quite literally away for the duration, life for the nation's women changed very dramatically. As well as caring for and feeding their children, they worked in the factories, taking the men's places on the production lines, playing a vital role in the manufacture of munitions and vehicles for the troops. Farming was also of crucial importance if the people of Britain were to survive the war years, but with few men left to work the land, it fell to the women to step into the breach. The Land Army girls came from all walks of life, with hairdressers turning their hand to cultivating livestock and debutantes learning how to plough a field. Just as had happened with the men, as the war went on, women aged between 19 and 30 had to register for war work. Many joined the forces as non-competent secretaries, drivers, cooks, nurses and mechanics. Others joined the Women's Royal Voluntary Service, better known as the WRVS, providing meals and clothing for the survivors of the bombing raids and the rescue workers. And of course, the Land Army and factory jobs also counted as war work. For a great number of people facing the horrors of war in their own homes, they'd already survived one world war that had been proclaimed the war to end all wars. The man responsible for making this statement had been the great British author H.G. Wells, who'd made many predictions about the future that would prove to be correct. However, on this occasion, very sadly for the sake of all humanity, his rhetoric about World War I was no more than wishful thinking. If the history of World War II has any lesson to lay down for future generations, the events that preceded Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's declaration of war with Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 are very telling. It's a journey that takes us right back to the end of World War I in 1918. A politically minded Austrian citizen who'd fought for the German army by the name of Adolf Hitler developed a very loud voice that he was determined the rest of the world would listen to, whether they liked it or not. There are many people who, with the great gift of hindsight, declare Adolf Hitler to have been a madman. And how right they are. However, the fact that he could be charming, eloquent and extremely persuasive made this fact very difficult to spot when he was rising to political power. And it's a salutary warning to every future generation that an excellent politician is not necessarily all that they might seem. Hitler was most dangerous because he was able to incite the people of Germany to follow him, democratically voting the dictator into high office. And he was able to do this by playing on the extreme sense of injustice felt by the nation after World War I. Born in what was in his day Austria-Hungary, on the 20th of April 1889, Adolf Hitler developed an anti-Semitic view even from his school days. And when he lost both his parents and found himself alone at the very impressionable age of 18, he moved to Vienna, where there was a large community of Jews. Unfortunately, young Adolf was not alone in his prejudice, as there were plenty of politicians, even the mayor of Vienna at the time, who incited public distrust of the Jews. Hitler didn't settle in Vienna for long, moving to Munich in Germany. And as the First World War broke out in 1914, he joined the Bavarian army and throughout the conflict fought as a fierce German patriot, even being honoured with the Iron Cross for bravery. When armistice came in 1918 with the German surrender, Hitler, like many fellow patriots, refused to accept that the army had actually been defeated and blamed the country's politicians for capitulating. The victorious Allies were determined that Germany would pay for their aggression, and with the Treaty of Versailles imposed an enormous war debt, forcing Germany to admit sole responsibility for the conflict. Also, valuable industrial land was stripped from them, and the German military disbanded in every form, with all the armament factories being destroyed. For Adolf Hitler, the world of politics beckoned, and as it became evident that Germany would never be able to pay its war debt, and living conditions for ordinary Germans spiralled into terrible hardship, he and like-minded colleagues stepped forward to offer words of comfort. The nation wanted answers for their plight, and Hitler's political party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, had the perfect scapegoat for all their troubles: the Jews. Through the 1920s and 30s, Hitler climbed steadily to power, convincing the people of Germany that he would save their great nation and put the country back on the economic map. This made him extremely popular, especially as his secret state police, the Gestapo, were given free rein to silence dissenters. When, in 1935, all Jews lost their German citizenship under Hitler's new laws, few non-Jews protested. The rest of the world woke up to the danger of Adolf Hitler when he violated the Treaty of Versailles in spectacular fashion, building a huge military machine, conscripting the many millions of disgruntled German unemployed into his army. With uniforms, youth movements, drums to bang and flags to wave, it appeared as if national pride had been restored. Hitler also forged important alliances with the fascist dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, Japan, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria to form the Axis powers. Back in Britain, in 1937, a new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, took charge of the country from Stanley Baldwin, and right from the outset, Adolf Hitler was never far from his thoughts. After pledging to respect Austrian independence, Hitler seized the country of his birth early in 1938 and turned his attention towards Czechoslovakia, and when he pledged to respect their independence too, the Czech government knew there was trouble ahead. Chamberlain did his utmost to broker a peaceful settlement, even flying to Germany in the autumn of 1938 to meet Hitler. The people of Britain waited expectantly for Chamberlain's return. Crowds gathered at the airport to see him wave a peace pact signed by Hitler and Mussolini. War had been averted, quite literally, at the 11th hour, and Chamberlain was given a hero's welcome, received by the King and Queen at Buckingham Palace and cheered by even bigger crowds outside number 10 Downing Street. Chamberlain proclaimed to the waiting nation and the rest of the world, "I believe it is peace in our time." On so many occasions already, Hitler had proved that he was a man not to be trusted, and by March 1939 he yet again went back on his word. Without any warning, the German army marched into Czechoslovakia, shattering any hope of peace, and to make matters worse, the Nazi war machine immediately set its sights on Poland. Chamberlain and the British government, along with the French, offered a guarantee of safety to Poland, seemingly secure in the knowledge that negotiations were underway with the Russians to form an alliance. But Adolf Hitler was one step ahead, and in August 1939 he secured a non-aggression pact with Russia, which left him a clear route into Poland. As far as Hitler was concerned, Britain and France hadn't stood up to him yet, and he believed that there would be no change now. After all, why would they go to war over Poland? There was no attempt to explore diplomatic avenues, and on the 1st of September 1939, the Nazis marched straight into Poland. To say that Adolf Hitler had his very own nemesis waiting in the wings in Britain perhaps sounds a little nebulous, but all through the appeasement process, one man had spoken out constantly of the real threat that Hitler posed. His name was Winston Churchill, a member of the British aristocracy as well as Parliament, and he was the surprise hero, well into his 60s, who would quite literally lead the people of Britain in their finest hour. When his pessimistic but realistic assessment of Adolf Hitler was proved correct, he took his place as the First Lord of the Admiralty, much to the comfort of the nation, as the fateful but expected news was announced. On Sunday, the 3rd of September, at 11:15 in the morning, the lawn mowers were silenced, the newspapers put to one side, and the children snatched from play as the entire population gathered around their wireless sets to hear the words of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. The storm clouds had been gathering for so long, this statement would have come as no surprise. Yet it was one of those historic moments that brought Britain to a standstill, as the full implications of what lay ahead had to be faced. As men joined the armed forces, families faced a new challenge that for city dwellers brought about a mass exodus of children to the countryside. In the first few weeks of the war, almost 2 million children were evacuated, being taken in by host families, although it wasn't quite as straightforward as the government would have liked people to believe. The clash between urban and rural cultures was understandably difficult for both the children and the hosts to deal with. Many inner city children came from terrible poverty, suffering poor health, and even at this early stage in the war, it was clear that social conditions would need to be reviewed once the conflict was over. The terror of anticipation gave way to an uneasy calm through the remainder of 1939, and it was even dubbed the Phony War. Quite a significant number of children returned to their homes in the towns and cities which they'd only just left. But this was definitely the lull before the storm, and as Britain learned to cope with the introduction of food rationing in the January of 1940, Hitler continued to threaten Europe and Scandinavia. Despite his assurances to the contrary, Hitler invaded first Denmark and then Norway. The Norwegians fought fiercely, as had the people of Poland, to stem the tide of the Nazi advance, but to no avail. The German war machine thundered on relentlessly. Hitler's next move was the most audacious to date, as his Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, smashed through the defences of Belgium, Holland, and even France. For the people of Britain, the Nazis were getting much too close for comfort, and any thoughts of a phony war were long forgotten. However, a wartime spirit was developing in Britain that would give Adolf Hitler a more difficult time than he'd arrogantly anticipated. For starters, the now much maligned Neville Chamberlain was replaced by Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of a new all-party government. Confidence in his ability to lead the nation was infectious, and one of Churchill's first speeches that offered nothing but his blood, toil, tears and sweat inspired an expectant people. With Hitler storming through continental Europe, the British Expeditionary Force in France were in terrible trouble, and alongside the Belgian and French soldiers battled their way northwards, defeated and struggling with every step to escape the advancing German army. Once quiet French country roads were littered with the machinery of war. This was a military disaster beyond compare. Thousands of the Allies' finest troops were destined to lose their lives, and as they converged on the French harbour of Dunkirk, the chances of being rescued from Hitler's devastating panzer divisions were getting slimmer by the hour. Back in Britain, the Admiralty prepared to send destroyers and transport ships, but considering the shallow waters along this stretch of coastline and the tide patterns, the most they could hope to rescue would be 30,000, leaving almost 1/3 men at the mercy of the Germans. This was undoubtedly the darkest moment yet for the British and Allied forces, but the intangible power of wartime Britain's indomitable spirit had not yet come into play. All along the south coast of England, the call went out for civilian craft to accompany the Royal Naval ships, and the public response was phenomenal. There were rowing boats, yachts, fishing vessels, tugs, paddle steamers, and in fact anybody who had a watertight craft that could get to France stepped forward to volunteer for king and country. Between the 27th of May and the 3rd of June 1940, the bravery and tenacity shown under extreme fire by military personnel and civilians alike brought about what can only be described as a miracle of deliverance, words that Winston Churchill chose with great care. The incredible result was that 226,000 British and 110,000 French troops were carried safely back to England, as the little boats ferried the men to the bigger ships, and even in some cases, all the way home. Not that there was ever any let-up from the Germans, who had the Allies on the run. Those who remained on the beaches to stem the tide of the advancing Nazi army faced certain death or capture, and the RAF battled furiously against Hitler's Luftwaffe to protect the exhausted soldiers on the open decks, who would otherwise have been sitting ducks. Dunkirk was a massive defeat. There's no question of that fact, and it highlighted just how vulnerable and unprepared the Allies were to face the Nazi war machine and Adolf Hitler's determination to achieve global domination. However, the forging of a fighting spirit in Britain and the occupied countries of Europe to resist their German conquerors would certainly be instrumental in the eventual demise of Adolf Hitler. There was also displayed here, for the Allies' military strategists, a chink in the Führer's armour that at least offered the most precious gift of hope when it had seemed so much would be lost. Hitler was so focused on advancing to take Paris, France's capital, he lost sight, albeit momentarily, of the bigger picture. This provided the Allies with a very brief window of opportunity, which is why the Great Escape from Dunkirk was possible. What happened next is very difficult for modern audiences to comprehend, but as Adolf Hitler planned to invade Britain, the threat of German occupation grew very real. Paris surrendered to the Germans on the 14th of June 1940. The following day, the British government announced that the Channel Islands would not be defended. By the end of the month, the German forces had occupied Guernsey, which was quickly followed by Jersey, Alderney and Sark. To this day, you'll still find reminders of the occupation along the now peaceful beaches of these beautiful islands. But back in 1940, for the people of Britain, the Nazi threat was far too close for comfort. If Adolf Hitler was going to successfully invade Britain, he first needed to eliminate the Royal Navy, a daunting task in itself. However, before such action could be taken, the RAF would have to be destroyed. This, according to the Luftwaffe, would be a much easier prospect. They truly believed the job would be done and dusted within 4 days, and the nation's aircraft industry would be out of action after just 4 weeks. Although there was a degree of arrogance on Hitler's part, on paper the RAF was considerably weaker than the Luftwaffe and distinctly lacking in trained pilots. Yet again, there was no allowance made for the great British spirit of the underdog that refused to be beaten. Also, they hadn't appreciated the power of the RAF's most precious weapon, radar, which, although in its early stages of development, allowed the British fighter pilots devastating accuracy. To get an idea of what life for the brave pilots and ground crew was like, a visit to the Aviation Heritage Centre can be very enlightening. This wonderful example in East Kirby in Lincolnshire really does take you back in time, and today we have the added bonus of observing a Spitfire in flight, a plane that was quite literally the epitome of the spirit of the Battle of Britain. Other aircraft played a vital role in World War II, including the Lancaster bomber, a fine specimen of which can also be found here at East Kirby. But it was the Spitfire that just the mention of boosted morale. At the outset of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe's concentrated attacks on the RAF's airfield and aircraft was very effective. And despite pilots from Allied nations arriving to boost numbers, casualties were high. It's interesting to note that despite America's late entry into the war, there was a band of remarkable American pilots who came to Britain anyway to lend their support, a contribution that was invaluable. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe's war of attrition was working, and whether propaganda after the event or gospel truth, it's been said that Hitler, unbeknownst to him, was only 24 hours away from victory. The RAF pilots were exhausted, but one of their number, in pursuit of a German bomber, chased his adversary over London, where the Luftwaffe pilot dropped his bombs. Winston Churchill immediately responded by ordering the bombing of German cities, believing it to have been a deliberate act of war against Britain's civilian population. Not to be outdone by Churchill's knee-jerk reaction, Hitler was equally enraged by his opposite number's attack on the fatherland, and ordered the Luftwaffe to redirect its campaign from the airfields of Britain to the beleaguered nation's cities. This was just the respite the RAF needed, and with characteristic resilience, trained new pilots and repaired their aircraft to thankfully fight another day. The Battle of Britain had been won by the RAF in the skies by the narrowest margin, and as the autumn leaves started to fall, Adolf Hitler had lost the opportunity to invade, as weather conditions and tide patterns turned against him. At this key point, Hitler, who had for the first time since he started his campaign of terror failed to gain the upper hand, needed to reconsider his strategy. For the time being, the British could keep their island, but he would make life as difficult as possible for them, blitzing the nation with nighttime bombing raids. If Hitler couldn't storm their green and pleasant land, he'd terrorise the people into submission by breaking their so-called wartime spirit. Hitler also looked to the east and began an onslaught on the Russian front, which would ironically meet with equally ferocious resistance. The idea of the Blitz was to force the British into a surrender, and although London definitely took the brunt of the Luftwaffe's relentless attacks, other cities also came under heavy fire. Coventry suffered utter devastation in the heart of the industrial Midlands, and the major south coast ports, including Portsmouth and Southampton, were strategic targets for the Germans. Plymouth was almost levelled to the ground, and many historic buildings were lost along with the men, women and children who died in the attacks. As autumn gave way to winter, Britain went into its first real Christmas at war, a real test for the morale of the people. Thousands of British servicemen had been killed, wounded or captured, and on the home front, many families had experienced the loss of friends or relations. Yet the nation had survived the Battle of Britain, and had Hitler had his way, the Third Reich would have already swallowed them up. So, despite the hardships, there was much to be thankful for. Although rations had become stricter, with bacon, butter, meat, sugar and tea in short supply, the tea ration was doubled for Christmas, and the quantity of sugar permitted increased. Non-rationed food was still available, with wines and spirits still quite plentiful, but at a price. Christmas gifts tended to be very practical, gardening tools and seeds being popular for a nation learning to dig for victory. But at the top of the 1940s must-have Christmas gift list was soap. There was a brief cessation of hostilities over the Christmas holiday, but as Big Ben rang in the new year of 1941, the people of Britain couldn't begin to imagine what the months ahead had in store for them, and whether they would even survive to see another Christmas and New Year. The early part of 1941 brought no let-up in Hitler's Blitz. By the time he scaled down the proceedings in May, as he deployed 2/3 of the German military machine on the Eastern Front, almost 1.5 million British people had been made homeless by the bombing, and 43,000 had actually lost their lives. The bombardment of British cities continued, as did the retaliatory strikes on the German people, but Hitler's sights were set on a much wider global objective. German forces arrived in North Africa and invaded Greece and Yugoslavia before Hitler's Operation Barbarossa saw the Nazis invade Russia. Like that other would-be ruler of the world, Napoleon, from a century and a half earlier, the first skirmishes went against the Russians, as Sebastopol fell and the Germans marched towards Moscow. History certainly repeated itself, however, as the Russian winter came in hard and fast, crippling the German advance, just as it had the French all those years earlier. Then, as people's minds turned towards another Christmas at war, the battle arena shifted to the Pacific as the Japanese decided to settle a few scores of their own. Early on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched a devastating attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It quite literally took the world unawares. The alliance formed by the Japanese with Adolf Hitler had inspired them to further incursions into China, and they then took French Indochina whilst posing a menacing threat to the British colonies in the Pacific. The Americans imposed oil embargoes in order to halt the advance of the Japanese, but this incited Japan to target the US Navy instead. While appearing to follow the diplomatic course, sending Japanese ambassadors to Washington, the strike force was dispatched in preparation for the attack on Pearl Harbor as global conflict became unavoidable. The United States were drawn into the conflict as Germany declared war on America. Japan invaded the Philippines, Burma and Hong Kong, with the fall of Singapore not long away, and the native people of the Pacific, along with the old colonials and Allied servicemen sent to protect them, experienced unimagined horrors at the hands of the occupying Japanese. For the people of Great Britain, the attack on Pearl Harbor might have seemed a million miles away, But the first direct result of this action was an influx of American servicemen, or GIs as they were more commonly known. A sense of optimism arrived with the young men, and for the young women of Britain, starved of male company for such a long time, the GIs, with their ready supplies of chocolate and nylon stockings, were extremely popular. Girls had resorted to having their legs painted with gravy browning and a line drawn up the back of their legs with an eyebrow pencil to give the effect of seamed stockings. For daytime, this was fine, but over-enthusiastic nighttime jitterbugging could give the game away. However, the British men left at home were far from enamoured with the glamorous American visitors, and the complaint went that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. As well as providing battalions of soldiers, airmen and sailors, the American government was able to replace the vehicles and munitions lost on the French roads on the way to escape at Dunkirk, putting the Allies back into World War II with a fighting chance. The British wartime spirit continued to stand firm in the face of privations and difficulties, and very slowly the news from overseas started to get better. In the Pacific, at the Battle of Midway, the USA turned the tide against the Japanese. And in North Africa, Britain's very own Field Marshal Montgomery, fondly known as Monty, took the initiative against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps at El Alamein, and the Russians valiantly counterattacked at Stalingrad. At last, Hitler was not having it all his own way, and when news reached the rest of the world about the terrible fate of the Jews in the Nazi concentration camps at places like Auschwitz, Dachau and Belsen, resolve hardened with pledges to avenge such horrendous crimes against humanity. As another year at war ended, and 1943 brought with it a promise of more of the same, Winston Churchill came into his own, keeping up Britain's morale with his fine speeches, supremely confident that right would prevail in the end. Elsewhere, the Russians were equally as focused, and in February 1943, the Germans were forced to surrender at Stalingrad, Hitler's first major defeat. However, in the Atlantic, the German U-boats were still winning the advantage at every turn. Then came a major breakthrough at Bletchley Park's top-secret communication headquarters, where the Enigma code was deciphered, allowing Allied shipping to predict accurately where the U-boats were going to strike next. Consequently, the battle for the Atlantic was all but over, and as spring gave way to summer, German and Italian forces surrendered to the Allies in North Africa. With strategic access to the Mediterranean from Tunisia, the Allies took Sicily and started to move up through Italy, but it was hard-fought progress which continued into the new year of 1944. Eventually, Rome was liberated on the 5th of June, but despite being a dramatic event, the newspapers of the world quickly carried a very different story. D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, has gone down in history as the beginning of the end of World War II. Sooner or later, the Allies would have to attack the German armies on mainland Europe, and after a great deal of planning, early June was selected when tide conditions were favourable. But things went far from smoothly. For months beforehand, the south coast of Britain had been transformed into an army camp as more than 3.5 million servicemen went into training for the big day. Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders and Allied forces from all over the world made ready to liberate the Nazi-occupied territories across the English Channel. The British have always been greatly mocked for being a nation obsessed with the weather, but in the June of 1944 there was definite cause for concern as storm force gales hit the Channel. The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, postponed the invasion from the 5th to the 6th of June because of the weather. But if the delay was to be any longer, it would literally be months before another attempt could be made. The armed forces were already aboard ship, and even though the weather was still atrocious, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead. If the D-Day invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, was to be successful, surprise would be the key element, and quite miraculously, 6,500 vessels transported 130,000 troops across the Channel on that stormy morning without the Germans knowing a thing about it. The RAF, notably Spitfires and Lancasters, kept the skies above clear as the Allied invasion force landed on the beaches of Normandy. German intelligence had confidently predicted that any invasion would come between Dover and Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. And although warnings had been given about a June invasion, they couldn't believe that anything would happen in such awful weather. So convinced were they that there was no immediate danger, Rommel, who was responsible for resisting any such invasion, went home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. It was a remarkable coup for Allied intelligence, although there was a worrying incident just days before the planned invasion. The Daily Telegraph crossword, a veritable British institution, had some very worrying answers through May and June. First, Utah appeared, the code name for one of the Normandy landing beaches, followed by Omaha, code name for the next of the landing beaches. Quickly superseded by Overlord, the entire operation, and Mulberry, the code name for the artificial harbours that were to be built after the landings. Things were looking very suspicious. Finally, Neptune, which was the code for the naval part of the proceedings, appeared on the 2nd of June, just days before the planned invasion. Compiled by an English schoolmaster who knew nothing of any invasion plans, or the significance of his choice of words, this strange phenomenon has been put down to coincidence, but it certainly gave MI5, Britain's spy agency, more than a few sleepless nights in the run-up to D-Day. Despite the discomfort of the journey, the first soldiers to land on Utah Beach had a very pleasant surprise, as, being slightly off course, they met little German resistance. Further down, on Omaha Beach, the same could not be said for the American forces that came ashore to sustain the heaviest casualties of the day. To complete the set, Gold, Juno and Sword beaches were taken by the rest of the Allies, and the push towards Paris and the French interior was well underway. It was only a relatively short distance in miles, but it took until August for the Allies to liberate Paris. But at last, Hitler's German army was on the run. Early in 1945, As the Allies were forging a path through Nazi-occupied Europe, the Russians were advancing on Berlin from the east. The people of Britain could only wait and hope for news that the war was over, as the Russians entered Berlin on the 21st of April with the Allies in hot pursuit. Holed up in his Berlin bunker, his dream of world domination in ruins, Adolf Hitler took his own life rather than face the consequences of his appalling actions. The war in Europe was over, and when news reached Britain, the celebrations were unparalleled. May the 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe, or VE Day, brought the entire population out onto the streets for a victory party that included everyone, from newborn babes in arms to the oldest citizens who'd never expected to live long enough to enjoy peace in their time. In London, the crowds flocked to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were joined by Winston Churchill to acknowledge the thanks of a grateful nation, and the carnival atmosphere lasted long into the night. One absentee from the celebrations was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president, who'd worked so hard alongside Winston Churchill in the hope of overthrowing tyranny and Nazi domination. Sadly, he died in April 1945, so close to the end of the war, and yet so far away. But the dilemma left to his successor over how to end the war for once and for all was indeed a poisoned chalice. President Harry S. Truman had a terrible choice to make, because the Japanese, tenacious to the last, had their own battles still to fight. Preparations for an invasion of Japan were in place, but casualties would be devastating for the American and Allied forces charged with this daunting task. Conversely, Truman had the atomic bomb in his arsenal, and although never tried, it could swiftly destroy Japanese resistance. He chose the latter option, wiping Hiroshima off the face of the earth on the 6th of August 1945, and Nagasaki a matter of days later. It was all over. The Japanese surrendered on the 14th of August, and the Americans celebrated Victory in Japan, or VJ Day, with the same gusto as the British people had VE Day some months earlier. As Winston Churchill had so aptly put it, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The entire population of the world owed their freedom from Nazi oppression to those that gave their lives in the conflict that was World War II. Britain was indeed a changed nation, and there was a certain charming innocence lost forever. Servicemen returning from the war refused to accept unemployment and demanded social change. Churchill, so much the man of the moment during the war, and his Conservative Party were rejected in favour of Clement Attlee's Labour government. The new health service provided cradle-to-grave medical care, free to all at the point of delivery, and nationalisation flourished as Britain clawed its way back to economic stability. It took some years for the privations of war to be forgotten, particularly as rationing in the immediate aftermath of the war got worse before it got better, eventually coming to an end on the 4th of July 1954. Our generation has been fortunate enough to have heard first-hand accounts of what life in wartime Britain was really like, And there's one thing that is absolutely constant. The spirit that united Britain during World War II was truly great. People might have been hungry, but they didn't starve. They had very little in terms of possessions and security, but what they had was shared. And phrases like "make do and mend," "dig for victory," and "waste not, want not" became a code to live by rather than resented constraints. Winston Churchill was the voice of the country, and when he called upon the people of Britain to rally to the battle cry, they responded again and again. It was indeed a nation's finest hour. Mention the spirit of Dunkirk today, and people will associate the phrase with that never say die mentality so closely associated with the British as a nation. However, few would be able to tell you more than the fact that Dunkirk had something to do with World War II, and that it's very probably a place in France. This is of course correct on both counts, although, metaphorically speaking, just the tip of the iceberg. The story of Dunkirk and the incredible bravery of servicemen and civilians alike is not only dramatically moving, but also positively inspirational, and this programme has been created to take you back to 1940 on a journey of discovery to find true courage in the face of terrible adversity. The miracle of Dunkirk, as Prime Minister Winston Churchill so eloquently described the Great Escape, happened early in World War II, between the end of May and the beginning of June 1940. However, before launching into a blow-by-blow account of the story of Dunkirk, the event does need to be set in context and viewed as the conflict in Europe escalated with Adolf Hitler's relentless march towards global supremacy. When the armistice was called in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the First World War was declared over. The war to end all wars. But sadly, this was wishful thinking. In the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles just outside Paris, the defeated Germans were forced to sign a treaty that insisted they accept total responsibility for causing the war, and the nation was stripped of valuable lands, which were distributed between France, Belgium, Poland, Lithuania, Denmark, and Czechoslovakia. Germany was also forbidden to have an army or any military capability, and the manufacture of arms or armaments was equally prohibited. In addition, a huge war debt was imposed upon Germany as reparation, which caused great hardship for the country's population throughout the 1920s. Such reprisals, although understandable, were unrealistic, creating a potentially dangerous atmosphere of injustice. Unfortunately for the rest of the world, this left the German people desperate for a strong leader who would take them out of poverty and into prosperity, and Adolf Hitler, rising rapidly to power, seemed to fit the bill perfectly. He cast aside the Treaty of Versailles to rebuild the German military, set the armaments factories back into production, and restored a sense of national pride. Hitler also gave vent to his own personal anti-Semitic prejudices by offering the German people a scapegoat for all their troubles, namely the Jews. Germany's European neighbours and Great Britain across the English Channel looked on in horror and disbelief at the actions of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi followers, as war with Germany for the second time in the 20th century became even more of a possibility. Hitler was born in Austria, although he later took German citizenship, and in 1938 he stormed into his former homeland, the first country on his list of conquests. Then Hitler turned his covetous eye towards Czechoslovakia, at which point the rest of the world realised just how dangerous Germany was becoming. Britain's new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew out to Germany in 1938 to broker a peaceful settlement. When he returned, clutching the signed Munich Pact, he declared that it was peace in our time. But his policy of appeasement proved to be ineffectual. Hitler treated the Munich Pact with the same contempt he'd applied to the post-World War I Treaty of Versailles. With no warning whatsoever, the German army marched into Czechoslovakia, and on the 1st of September 1939 began their occupation of Poland. The Allied nations of Britain and France had promised protection to Poland, secure in the knowledge that negotiations were underway with the Russians to join the alliance. But Hitler was at least a step ahead of them. Already allied with Italy, Japan, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria to form the Axis powers, Hitler had already negotiated a non-aggression pact with Stalin and the Russians. It was indeed a great blow to the British and the French, left alone without Russian support, yet they stood by their promise to Poland. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain gave Hitler an ultimatum. Either the German army was to withdraw from Poland by 11 a.m. on Sunday the 3rd of September, or a state of war would exist between Britain and Germany. As the time ticked by, there was no word from Hitler, and just 15 minutes after the deadline, Chamberlain took to the airwaves and informed the British nation in a radio broadcast that they were now at war with Germany.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, here is a recorded message from the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Neville Chamberlain.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
After a veritable flurry of activity as the men of Britain joined the armed forces and children were evacuated from the nation's cities to the safety of the countryside, there was a distinct feeling of anti-climax. So much so that this period towards the Christmas of 1939 was known as the Phony War, because in Britain the expected aggression from Germany failed to materialise. However, this was not because Hitler was suddenly calling a halt to his empire building. He was simply occupied elsewhere, invading Denmark and Norway. The people of Britain certainly enjoyed a period of calm before the storm, although the British Expeditionary Force, more commonly known as the BEF, was dispatched to the Franco-Belgian border. In point of fact, this historic fighting force was established after the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, just in case Britain ever needed to deploy a force to take part in an overseas war again. It was a wise precaution, because at the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the BEF was sent immediately to Flanders, where they fought bravely for king and country. And, quite naturally, the same course of action was taken in September 1939, when the BEF was called to arms once more. As 1940 progressed, Hitler's stranglehold on the countries the Germans had already occupied increased, and his forays into new territories became more and more audacious. On the 10th of May, the Blitzkrieg began, as the Nazis marched into the neutral Low Countries of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. It was a vicious onslaught as civilians were targeted by the Luftwaffe in particular, and terror reigned across Europe. In Britain, confidence in Neville Chamberlain's government had reached an all-time low as the Nazi threat grew more menacing daily. Ironically, on the 10th of May, as Hitler's Blitzkrieg began, Prime Minister Chamberlain resigned and was succeeded by Winston Churchill. It was an appointment that would inspire the British people throughout the forthcoming war years, as Churchill offered his own blood, toil, tears and sweat. Not to mention his remarkable oratory skills that would literally change the course of history. With Churchill at the helm, a wartime spirit was quick to develop across the length and breadth of Great Britain, and within days of his appointment, a call went out to the boat enthusiasts of the nation. At this stage, there was no immediate threat to the BEF on the continent, but nonetheless, a naval staff officer at Whitehall had this message broadcast after the 9 o'clock news on the 14th of May. The Admiralty have made an order requiring all owners of self-propelled pleasure craft between 30 and 100 feet in length to send any further particulars of them to the Admiralty within 14 days from today, if they've not already been offered or requisitioned. We don't know which far-sighted soul set this plan in motion. Her name has not been recorded, but the timing was incredible, as was the response. From all around the coast of Britain, offers of small craft flooded in, and a people's navy was literally put on standby. Within days of the appeal being broadcast, the situation across the Channel changed dramatically. France was suddenly under siege from the Germans. The military might of Hitler's war machine was staggering in its efficiency. The BEF found itself caught in a seemingly inescapable trap between a pincer movement of land attacks while the Luftwaffe bombarded France from the skies. The only hope of a breakout lay with the prospect of Allied troops from southern France coming to the rescue. But the BEF at the front and the military commanders back in London quickly realised that this was an impossibility. Retreat to the coast to await rescue from the sea was now the only option, although the Admiralty were very aware that only a small percentage of the BEF could be saved. Getting on for 500,000 Allied troops, including the BEF, French and Belgian soldiers, were cut off by the advancing Germans, and it was estimated that there would only be the opportunity to rescue about 45,000 men. The shortest route back to Britain would have been between Calais and Dover, but with the Germans already in control there, and also at Boulogne, the only option left was Dunkirk. As the third largest harbour in France, Dunkirk was certainly a viable option, but with shallow waters along the port's neighbouring beaches, there was going to be a problem getting large naval vessels close enough to evacuate the BEF. The small pleasure boats registered with the Admiralty were going to be of vital importance to the operation, and fortunately for all concerned, they were already on standby. By the 26th of May, it was obvious that any further delay in launching a rescue mission from Dover would risk the lives of the BEF even further, and Operation Dynamo, as the evacuation from Dunkirk was codenamed, was given the go-ahead. Events validated the decision on the 28th of May, when the Belgian king, Leopold, ordered a ceasefire and surrendered to the Germans, dealing a bitter blow to his allies, whose forces were left even further exposed to the advancing Nazis. Yet, despite the overwhelming advantage Hitler's troops undoubtedly possessed, as the Allies retreated to Dunkirk, they failed to capitalise upon the situation fully. This is one of the most fascinating subjects for discussion amongst military historians, and is the most contentious issue to arise from the entire 6-week battle for France. After the capture of Boulogne, German panzers secured a strong bridgehead over the Aar Canal, leaving just a short charge for Dunkirk and the retreating Allies within the Germans' grasp. Then, on the 24th of May, the strangest thing happened. An order came through from Supreme Command, directly from Adolf Hitler. Without explanation, the entire left wing of this German attack was halted on the banks of the Aar, forbidden to go any further. The panzer divisions were told to hold the line of the canal and make use of the period of rest for general recuperation. The terrain around Dunkirk was flat and marshy, and there are those who believed that Hitler didn't want his panzer divisions endangered unnecessarily. The BEF and remaining French and Belgian soldiers were, as the Germans arrogantly believed, doomed, leaving little urgency to finish the task at speed. Others have suggested that Hitler was already planning his triumphant entry into Paris with his panzer divisions intact, in effect jumping the gun, so to speak. There have been even more fanciful theories postulated, including Hitler deliberately creating a golden bridge for the BEF to escape the carefully laid German trap. The reason for such action was the view that Hitler was hoping to enhance the prospect of peace negotiations with Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the newly formed British all-party government. However, with the benefit of hindsight, and Hitler's plans to invade Britain already drawn up, it's hardly a viable conspiracy theory. Perhaps the most feasible explanation concerns the Luftwaffe and the German Air Force's Commander-in-Chief, Hermann Göring. When he viewed the progress reports from northern France, he believed that his Luftwaffe should be allowed the glory of finishing off the stranded Allied troops. With this in mind, he would have requested that Hitler halt the armoured units on the ground to give the aircraft a clear run at their target. In the circumstances, there would have appeared no urgency. After all, with close on 500,000 Allied troops retreating towards the sea with little or no hope of rescue, the Germans could take their time. For the men of the BEF, making their weary way to Dunkirk, many wounded, with the majority having had no sleep or food and little water for days, it was a very uncertain time. There was nowhere to shelter in safety amongst the dunes on the beaches of Dunkirk, but the troops did their best to dig in for the duration. However, this became harder as more and more troops arrived. The German planes, particularly the Stukas, dive-bombed the huddled masses, whilst their Nazi comrades in arms were shelling from land and sea. The evacuation of Dunkirk took only a matter of days, but for the Allied servicemen on the beaches, it must have seemed an eternity. They had no idea of what was happening or how long their ordeal was going to last, and the genuine fear that they may never see the white cliffs of Dover again must have weighed heavy on every man's heart. However, this was where the phrase, "the spirit of Dunkirk," comes from. The conditions were appalling. The dead littered the overcrowded ground, and there was little information available. But somehow, the men on the beaches quickly learnt that if you could control your fear when the German bombers actually attacked, it was possible to fight back. The noise was the worst part, but a steady hand, cool, accurate eye, and a rifle could bring down a diving bomber very effectively. And there are many tales told of great valour under fire on those fateful days in May 1940. It was in this atmosphere of terror that the surviving BEF, French and even Belgian soldiers waited at Dunkirk in ever-increasing numbers. Whilst back in London, the Admiralty realised that the task of evacuating the beaches was far greater and more urgent than they'd ever imagined. Then a telephone message came through from Vice Admiral Ramsay of the Royal Navy. "We may be able to do a much bigger thing at Dunkirk. Can you get every available craft round to me within 24 hours? It was such an ordinary sounding request, but the response can only be described as extraordinary. Instantly, the Admiralty called up all the boat owners who'd offered their craft as men and boats arrived at given destinations along the south coast. The action was swift and top secret. The civilian fishermen, tugboat skippers and yachtsmen were told little more than the operation they'd volunteered for was likely to prove dangerous. With nothing more than an allocation of tin hats for protection, Britain's most unlikely fleet left under the cover of darkness on their rescue mission to bring home the survivors from Dunkirk. It's hard to imagine what the thousands of men packed onto the beaches of Dunkirk thought as the flotilla of small boats came into view. But the realisation that rescue was now a possibility must have been a tremendous relief after such hardship. There was no panic or rush for the boats. Discipline prevailed as the men patiently waited their turn. Although amongst the smoke and devastation, it was evidently a frantic scramble at times. This eyewitness account from one of the volunteer skippers is very telling indeed. Machine gun bullets and bombs were falling like hail around the rescue ships and the troops left on the sands waiting to be taken off. I took my boat ashore to the nearest group waiting shipment. I had my boat full before I could say Jack Robinson. Between the 30th of May and the 3rd of June 1940, the little ships transported the men from the Dunkirk beaches to the larger naval vessels lying off the coast of France. The German onslaught never let up, and the sunken shipping littering Dunkirk harbour made the passage to safety even more hazardous. Many of the volunteer-manned smaller craft actually made the trip backwards and forwards between Dunkirk and the English coast time and time again, despite the constant threat posed by the Luftwaffe. With men packed onto open boat decks, the terror from the skies could have been devastating. The men of the BEF may have, in the first instance, thanked God for the British Navy, but over the nautical miles back home to England, they also owed a great debt of gratitude to the RAF. Hitler and Goering believed that the Luftwaffe could stop the Allied escape from Dunkirk. But Lieutenant General Baron von Richthofen, a relative of the flying ace the Red Baron from World War I, thought otherwise. As commander of the Stuka dive bomber squadrons, he was more realistic than his superiors, commenting to a fellow officer that, "Unless the Panzers can get moving again at once, the English will give us the slip. No one can seriously believe that we alone can stop them from the air." The Luftwaffe and the RAF fought for opposing sides in the war, but there was always a mutual respect between the airmen, and Richthofen was sensible enough to respect the British Royal Air Force. Today, this beautifully restored Spitfire is making a display flight over the Lincolnshire countryside, where it will land at the Aviation Heritage Centre at East Kirkby. It was from airfields very similar to this one that the young British fighter pilots took to the skies to tackle the mighty Luftwaffe in order to protect the precious fighting force being rescued from France. The Spitfires played an important role, along with the larger bombers taking on the coastal attacks. It cannot be denied, the RAF suffered heavy losses. But in the dark days of Dunkirk, they inflicted more damage on the enemy than they received, which proved crucial, ensuring the escape of over 330,000 Allied servicemen. There were British soldiers who fought on the beaches of Dunkirk who watched the flotilla of little ships come and go, carrying their compatriots back to Britain, but they knew there was no such happy ending for them. A small British detachment was sent to nearby Calais to fight a rearguard action, where they bravely held out against the Germans for several days, playing their part in the operation. Sadly, almost all of this gallant force was killed or taken prisoner, knowingly paying the ultimate price for the good of their fellow man. News of the miraculous events at Dunkirk began to reach the British public, and the people of Dover and the other ports into which the rescued soldiers were brought soon saw for themselves the results of Operation Dynamo. Trains were marshalled to control points and stations taken over as every effort was made to get the troops away from the south coast as quickly as possible. Volunteers, mainly women, worked tirelessly around the clock to provide food and clothing for the rescued men before they were sent on their way. At Weymouth, a railway worker handed out blank Great Western Railway postcards to the soldiers so they could write just 2 words, "Am safe," along with their name and address to be sent to their loved ones. No stamp or postmark was required. It was typical of the way in which a grateful nation rallied to the cause. Everywhere, the people of Britain talked of Dunkirk, and Winston Churchill gave some of his finest speeches in direct response to what had happened. Britain's Prime Minister described Dunkirk as a miracle of deliverance achieved by valour, by perseverance, by perfect discipline and dauntless service, by resource, by skill, and by unconquerable fidelity. When he declared that 1,000 British ships rescued over 335,000 men, French and British, out of the jaws of death, a cheer went up in the House of Commons at the astounding figures. Churchill then went on to praise the Royal Air Force, who had inflicted upon the Germans losses at least 4-1, before finishing his oratory with words that have gone down in history. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. This was fighting talk indeed, yet Nevertheless, he acknowledged the military disaster that Dunkirk undoubtedly was. But for Winston Churchill and every patriotic soul in Britain, a legendary spirit rose out of those few brief May and June days when the British Expeditionary Force was brought safely home, quite literally, to fight another day. When Rudyard Kipling spoke of triumph and disaster, and treating those two impostors just the same in his inspirational poem If, no better lines could have been written for the men on the beaches at Dunkirk. It had been a disaster, but the spirit of Dunkirk had triumphed, and for the British people facing the threat of a Nazi invasion, it was just the morale boost that was needed, and never one to miss an opportunity. Winston Churchill exploited the safe return of 250,000 men from Dunkirk to the full. The people of France, who'd also fought so bravely for the rescue effort at Dunkirk, could sadly find no consolation in the operation's successful outcome. Their beloved homeland was now overrun with German troops celebrating a great victory, with orders to march on to the nation's capital, Paris, and seize it as a prize for Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. For the French, many felt that Dunkirk marked the moment when they'd been abandoned by their British allies. From their point of view, rather than being a rescue operation, it had quite simply been desertion. Once Paris had fallen, the situation in France was a desperate one. An armistice was signed with Germany by the puppet French Vichy government that occupied a token area of France, with Marshal Pétain, an ageing World War I hero, in control. The rest of the nation was under Nazi domination, but for the proud French, the fight against German tyranny would never be given up. The French resistance worked secretly to undermine the occupying army at every possible opportunity, bravely risking their lives in the fight for liberty on a daily basis. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, fled to England to continue the opposition against Hitler. But after having gone as far as he could go, reaching the coast of northern France, the German dictator looked across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. On their return to Britain, the men involved in the escape from Dunkirk were revered as war heroes. The newspapers were filled with stories of heroism in the face of extreme danger, and the reality of the conflict, which had so far failed to significantly touch the lives of the people of the United Kingdom, suddenly hit home. Up until Dunkirk, talk of the war had been the province of the press and the politicians, but every town and village across the nation could count amongst their own the brave boys rescued by the flotilla of naval and civilian craft. The German High Command had evidently underestimated the resourcefulness of the British armed forces, on land, over sea and in the air, but fortunately for Britain, and the rest of the world, it was a lesson that they failed to learn from. Irritating as the escape of the BEF from under the German noses must have been, it was a minor annoyance on the road to Nazi supremacy. There was no allowance made by the Germans for the huge psychological morale boost that Dunkirk had given the people of Britain and its military personnel. The spirit of Dunkirk would have a direct bearing on what was to come next for every man, woman and child throughout the land. Hitler believed that he and the German army would win the Battle of Britain with ease, whereas Winston Churchill and the people of Britain knew it was a battle that would not be lost. It was the same indomitable spirit that had prevailed at Dunkirk that would preserve the nation for the next phase of Hitler's onslaught. As a seafaring nation, the British Navy had always been a force to be reckoned with, and Hitler was very aware that the smaller German navy would never stand any chance of crossing the English Channel to mount an attack, with the full force of Britain's naval defences at battle stations. However, in the eyes of Adolf Hitler, the British Air Force was a much easier target, particularly as their German equivalent, the Luftwaffe, were at least on paper significantly stronger. The low-key reporting of the RAF's vital contribution in the escape from Dunkirk was certainly helpful, as even Winston Churchill had felt it necessary to point out to the House of Commons the remarkable achievements of the British fighter pilots. Wars are not won by evacuations, but there was a victory inside this deliverance which should be noted. It was gained by the Air Force. Many of our soldiers coming back have not seen the Air Force at work. They saw only the bombers which escaped its protective attack. They underrate its achievements. Hitler, in his march towards the invasion of Britain, also made the mistake of underrating the RAF, but from the standpoint of military strategy, he targeted his enemy well. The Royal Air Force were lacking in aircraft. The German Luftwaffe had many more planes and, even more importantly, far greater numbers of fighter pilots to fly them. For the British airmen, the stereotypical image of well-educated, handsome young men with flamboyant moustaches risking their lives every time they took to the air is perhaps one of the most romantic of the entire war. As Hitler instigated the Battle of Britain, they were, however, something of a rare breed, as the RAF could only muster about 800 fighter pilots, and, quite understandably, Hitler believed that the battle for control of the English skies would be over very quickly indeed. After all, Winston Churchill himself had felt it necessary to give the RAF a vote of confidence in his speech after Dunkirk. So how could an unequipped air force manned by young, inexperienced pilots save Britain from the disaster of a Nazi invasion? Surely this was more than even the great Winston Churchill could ask of RAF Fighter Command. But in the days and months that followed Dunkirk, when the call to battle came, the RAF was determined to prove that this would be their finest hour. In the first instance, the Luftwaffe targeted the air bases of southern England, destroying planes which were already in short supply. The British did have the advantage of James Watson Watt's newly invented radar, and although by no means perfect, it could track the Luftwaffe in flight and help predict where they would attack. Needless to say, the German Air Force soon targeted the radar masts, as well as the airfields and ground crew, where the workload was relentless as everyone rallied to keep the British fighter pilots in the air. The deadly threat to the ground crew in the attacks on the airfields meant that they faced as much danger as the pilots, and after a short period of attrition, the Luftwaffe was in the ascendancy. The pilots and ground crew were so depleted in numbers that those who survived were managing on less and less sleep as the enemy just kept coming. However, the same spirit that had fortified the courage and tenacity of the British Expeditionary Force on the beaches of Dunkirk prevailed, until Hitler took a similar fateful decision to the one he'd made, halting the German Panzer Division at the Ahr Canal. Call it fate, good fortune, the sun shining on the righteousness, dramatic irony, or what you will. But at the 11th hour, when the RAF knew that they were all but beaten, Hitler changed his tactics, and in the brief moment of respite, the British Air Force regrouped and survived, literally, to fight another day. Some say that the Germans were within hours of winning the Battle of Britain when Hitler gave the order for the Luftwaffe to switch their attacks to London, the nation's capital. By all accounts, a German bomber, being hotly pursued by a British fighter pilot, dropped his bomb load over London. Churchill, believing that this was a deliberate act of war, retaliated by dispatching the RAF to bomb German cities. Incensed, Hitler took the immediate decision to adopt the Blitz tactics that had worked so well for him on mainland Europe. The Battle of Britain was about to become the Battle of London, and the civilians of the city would need to foster the spirit of Dunkirk if they were to stand any chance of surviving. The Blitz began in earnest in September 1940, as the Luftwaffe dropped their bombs every night in an attempt to break the British spirit and terrorise the people into submission. Britain stood alone against Hitler, but far from demoralising the population, the vicious attacks only made the people more determined to stand against German aggression. Every night, as the air raid siren sounded, families made their way to garden shelters, and in London, down into the underground stations for protection. In the mornings, people sifted through the damage, buried their dead and grieved for those lost, and continued to defy Hitler. Other towns and cities were targeted. Plymouth, Southampton, Birmingham and Coventry all suffered the Luftwaffe's bombing raids, with Coventry sustaining the most terrible losses. It took all Winston Churchill's leadership skills to keep the spirit and willpower of the beleaguered British people positive, but he succeeded admirably. The Luftwaffe was no respecter of rich or poor. The poverty-stricken of London's East End were bombed, as were the highest-ranking people in the land. Even Buckingham Palace suffered a degree of damage, and the King and Queen became icons of the British fighting spirit, visiting those who'd lost their homes and loved ones to offer any words of comfort they could. As 1940 gave way to 41, the people of Britain held out against the Blitz with a remarkably cheerful spirit. What the BEF had learnt on the beaches of Dunkirk, the entire nation discovered as the air raid sirens screamed out. Eventually, just as had happened at Dunkirk and in the Battle of Britain, tenacity paid off. By June 1941, the Germans, having failed to capitalise on the advantages gained on mainland Europe, turned their attention away from Britain. Hitler had failed to conquer the island nation, and with the momentum lost, he instigated Operation Barbarossa on the Russian front. Throughout the remainder of the war, bombing raids on Britain continued, but never with the brutal intensity that had characterised the Blitz. The British as a nation had weathered the gathering storm of Adolf Hitler. Firstly, the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk stood firm until they could be rescued by the Navy and that remarkable flotilla of civilian boats. Then the Royal Air Force held out against the Luftwaffe until a lone German bomber quite unintentionally changed the focus of attack. And last, but definitely not least, the people of Britain showed immense courage under fire until Hitler turned his attention from the west to the east, as the global implications of World War II gave the British people a much-needed period of respite. By the end of 1941, world events had changed the progress of the war dramatically, most notably the Japanese attack on the American Navy at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. Within days, Britain no longer stood alone against the Axis powers and Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, because America entered the war, bringing with her much-needed men, machinery and money to boost the Allied cause and fight their own battles against the Japanese in the Pacific. The first American GIs arrived in Britain in the new year of 1942 with a sense of optimism that added a dynamic edge to the stoicism that the nation had endured. However, not everyone was pleased to see them. The expression, overpaid, oversexed and overhere, was often used to describe the American servicemen, although the younger female population of Britain, long starved of male company, certainly seemed to appreciate the GIs. For the Allied forces, the second half of 1942 brought with it the first glimmers of hope as chinks began to appear in the Axis powers' armour. At the Battle of Midway, in the Pacific, the Americans turned the tables on the Japanese. In North Africa, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery led his men to victory at El Alamein, and the Russian forces counterattacked the Nazi incursion at Stalingrad. News of Hitler's barbaric treatment of the Jews began to reach the Allies, confirming the free world's worst fears of what Adolf Hitler was capable of. There was no time to lose in the battle against Nazi domination, and throughout 1943, the tide against Hitler continued to turn. The threat posed by German U-boats in the Atlantic was neutralised when British codebreakers cracked Enigma to reveal the deadly vessel's whereabouts. In Russia, the Eastern Front gathered pace as land was snatched back for the Allies, and thoughts turned towards an invasion from Britain to liberate Nazi-occupied France. June the 6th, 1944, has gone down in history as D-Day, the beginning of the end of World War II. In the weeks prior to this auspicious date, the south of England was transformed into a virtual army camp as men and machinery from Britain, America, Canada and other Allied countries gathered in preparation for the attack on Hitler. Unlike the aftermath of Dunkirk 4 years earlier, this time the troops were preparing to leave Britain to revisit the beaches of northern France. They had no intention of being driven back into the sea. The Allied invasion force, under the command of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was an army of liberation rather than one in retreat, and the people of France had waited an awful long time for this moment to come. Hitler knew that an Allied invasion was imminent, but believed that it would come between Dover and Calais, taking the very beaches of Dunkirk that had been evacuated. This was crucial to the mission, as the area targeted by the Allies was to be between Cherbourg and Caen, much further along the Normandy coast, because the element of surprise would be a significant factor if the Allies were going to succeed. The weather in the June of 1944 was unseasonable to say the least, with gales and storms more appropriate to the middle of winter. Crossing the Channel was far from smooth, as over 130,000 men were carried by some 6,500 vessels to the beaches of Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Depending on where they landed, the German resistance ranged from little or nothing to all-out warfare, and the Americans who landed on Omaha Beach suffered the greatest losses. Despite the casualties, Operation Overlord was successful, as slowly but surely the Allies liberated France before beginning the final push towards Berlin. On the Eastern Front, the Russians were also heading for Berlin, having liberated the concentration camp at Auschwitz early in 1945, revealing the true horrors of the Holocaust. The Russians reached Berlin first on the 21st of April 1945, quickly followed by the Western Allies. For Hitler, there was no escape, and he took his own life on April the 30th. The war in Europe was over, and when Germany surrendered unconditionally on the 7th of May, the whole world celebrated. However, the war in the Pacific continued for just a short while longer, until, on the 6th of August 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese at Hiroshima. A second atomic bomb was dropped 3 days later on Nagasaki, and on the 14th of August, the Japanese surrendered. World War II was over. The biggest conflict history had ever known had reached its conclusion, leaving some 50 million people dead, more than 6 million of whom were Jews. It was a high price to pay, but the world could at last look forward to a peaceful future. In Britain, the celebrations brought the grateful nation together for one last time as Prime Minister Winston Churchill joined the royal family on the balcony at Buckingham Palace to wave to the crowds. The spirit of unity, bravery and camaraderie that had grown in the men's hearts all those years ago on the beaches of Dunkirk had evidently proved to be extremely contagious. Today, those who lived through the years of conflict often remember that wartime spirit which brought the people of Britain together in the fight against tyranny and Adolf Hitler with nostalgia and a surprising fondness. And who can say, if the need ever arose again, would the spirit of Dunkirk move an entire nation to stand and be counted once more? The answer is a very probable yes. because it's a rare gift that the British have for making the best of a difficult situation. That stiff upper lip, backs against the wall mentality, so typified by Winston Churchill, may give rise to humour throughout the rest of the world. But the ability to transform the escape from Dunkirk into the motivation for a nation's survival is intrinsic to this particular island race, and will continue to be so for as long as people remember the dark days of 1940 and the triumph of the human spirit on the beaches of Dunkirk.